Hi, welcome to the second tutorial on writing. Today we're going to discuss style. So far our discussion of writing has been purely negative. We've told you two things to avoid. Don't be indifferent to the truth, and don't write things that are unclarifiably unclear. With very little effort you can convert these negative statements into positive prescriptions for good writing. Always write with concern for the truth, and always write clear and precise prose. What's more difficult is to figure out precisely how you do that. Obviously, you need to practice a lot, but it's also important to practice with the right goals in mind so that you don't end up practicing the wrong things. So this forces the question, what are the right goals? To my mind, there's no better statement of the goals of nonfiction writing than you can find in this short book, Clear and Simple as the Truth. I recommend that you all read it, and what follows here is my attempt to describe its basic claims. Thomas and Turner begin by arguing that writing instruction with a focus on technical skills has a very limited value. And they make this point by drawing a comparison between a bad writer and a bad conversationalist. They say a bad conversationalist may have a very high level of verbal skills, but perform poorly because he does not conceive of conversation as distinct from a monologue. No further cultivation of verbal skills will remedy his problem. So the idea is the person who monologues, who doesn't engage in conversation as give and take, it doesn't matter how verbally skilled he is, he's going to be a bad conversationalist because he doesn't understand the goal of a conversation. Likewise, you could master spelling, punctuation, and grammar and still produce confused, bland, and unreadable prose. And the basic idea here is you can be a bad conversationalist or a bad writer because you fail to understand the goals of the activity that you're engaged in. So that's where Thomas and Turner say we should start. And they argue that any attempt to teach writing without consideration of style is doomed because style is an intellectual stand on the goals of writing. It's a stand that the author takes on the issues of truth, presentation, writer, reader, thought, language, and the relationship between thought and language. So for them, writing is not a technical skill. It's an intellectual stand that the author takes. It's a set of goals and commitments that she has in mind when she sits down to write. From here, Thomas and Turner go on to argue that the biggest mistake that authors make when they talk about style is to assume that there's only one correct style. This is totally false because there are many purposes for writing, and every purpose has its own style. And so they argue that it's naive to think that you could master writing in general, and therefore they recommend one style in particular, what they call classic style. So what recommends classic style? There's at least 3 reasons for focusing on it. 1, it's good for university. It's perfect for the kind of assignments that you have to write. It's good for work after university. It's clear and engaging. It's the sort of writing people like to read. And it's something that you can master in a short amount of time. In other words, classic style is for everybody. It was assembled out of the attitudes and techniques that are available to everybody. There's a definite and noble path to learning classic style, and you can acquire it fully. When you do, it is yours. The classic writer impersonates no one. So what exactly is classic style? Well, as we just saw, style is a stance, an intellectual stand on truth, presentation, writer, reader, thought, language, and their relationships. And so classic style is a particular stand on all of these elements of writing, and we're going to look at each one in turn. So the first element of classic style we want to look at is its approach to the truth. The truth may be inconvenient, it might cause you discomfort, and you might avoid pursuing it out of sheer laziness. But if you make the effort, the truth can be known. The basic idea here is that all of us have access to the truth, and this thesis was first made plausible and attractive by René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes' thesis is that everybody has what is essential for identifying truth, natural reason, whether or not that person has any special educational formation. Failure to identify truth comes either from directing natural reason to the wrong objects or from uncritically accepting opinion and custom. Everyone who has cleared away the normal mental impediments is equally capable of perceiving what is certainly true and can personally stand behind his perception. This is something that Descartes believed fully, and he thought anybody could read his books and understand them. And for that reason, he wrote some of the most accessible books in the history of Western ideas. Now, another aspect of this conception of truth is that it conceives of thought as a kind of perception, and it uses visual perception as a metaphor. So let's say I tell you that down the street there's a factory with a red and white chimney. You can easily walk down the street if you're a sighted person, and you can verify that claim for yourself. This is the basic model for writing under the classic approach. It's just like sharing a visual perception. So when I shared that perception with you, it had the structure of I see something, I point it out to you, and you see it for yourself. And here, writing is understood as analogous to sharing a visual perception. On the classic approach, thinking is seeing, or more generally, recognizing. Writing is presenting what the writer has seen so the reader can see it too. The classic writer seems to be trying to place something before your eyes, or trying to put you where he is so you can see what he sees. For that reason, the highest value in classic style is clarity, because all you need to do is to give your reader an unobstructed view so she can see the truth for herself. That's why Thomas and Turner placed this quote at the opening of their book. Above all, I have clarity at heart. My style will not be at all florid. My expressions will be as simple as the truth. The idea is, using clear expressions is the best way and the most forceful way to present the truth. So writing isn't about persuading, it's about presentation. The second element of writing we want to look at is presentation. The classic approach to presentation follows naturally from its approach to the truth. Since every person has access to the truth, the only thing one needs to accomplish in presentation is to get out of the way, to give the reader an unobstructed view of the subject that you're writing about. So Thomas and Turner tell us that writing is supposed to be a perfectly transparent window through which a subject is presented. Basically, the classic writer never calls attention to his or her writing. What they focus on is always the subject, and they don't put anything in their writing that distracts the reader from that subject. Classic style also makes some important assumptions about the writer that we need to address. The first assumption is that the writer is authentic. This means that the writer stands fully behind what she has to say because she has thought it out independently. So authenticity here means that it comes from the writer herself. She takes full responsibility for it. Classic writing also assumes that the writer is sufficient. In other words, she's up to the task. She doesn't say things like, "Who am I to say?" She never says that because she is someone who was authorized by the truth that she's seen independently. So she writes without hesitation, without hedging, without any kind of neurotic self-doubt. She never puts her doubts on paper. All she gives us is the finished product. The writer is also assumed to be competent. It's paralyzing to think of how many things can go wrong in an attempt to present something clearly and accurately. Perhaps you cannot see straight. Perhaps you cannot express what you see. Perhaps your conceptual instruments are dull. You might have disabling gaps in your knowledge. You might be lying to yourself. Classic style liberates you from this kind of self-doubt. It doesn't mean that you won't have self-doubt when you sit down to write. What it means is that you never put that self-doubt into your essay. Everyone knows that writing can be difficult, but it's extremely tedious to point it out. So classic style gives you a kind of freedom to forget about yourself when you write. Classic writing also assumes that the writer does all the work invisibly. She is not like a television cook showing you how to mix mustard in balsamic vinegar. She's like a chef whose work is presented to you at table, but whose labor you are never allowed to see. A labor the chef certainly does not expect you to share. So you never write something like this. Here I am, sat down at my computer at 3 a.m. I've been thinking about this problem for days, but I haven't been able to write anything. That does not belong in your essay. Classic writing is perfect performance. It does all the work invisibly. All you see is the final product. How does classic style conceive of its reader? The classic author doesn't beg for her reader's interests. On the contrary, she takes her reader's confidence and interest for granted. Classic style is modeled on the core concept of conversation between equals. There's an implicit symmetry in the relationship between the writer and the reader. The model assumes that the reader could take the next turn in the conversation. So when you think about who your reader is as a classic author, you're assuming she's just an equal who knows the material well enough that she could take the next turn in the conversation. So there's a symmetrical relationship. With that in view, we can now turn to the final set of assumptions of the classic style, those pertaining to thought and language. According to classic style, thought precedes speech. Writing is not thinking. You never do your thinking as part of your actual writing. The point is to think first and then write so that the final product doesn't show your work. Remember, the classic writer does all the work invisibly. Right? So classic writing conceives of writing as an instrument for presenting what the writer has already thought. It's not an instrument for thinking things through. Secondly, language is sufficient. The classic writer never drones on about the inadequacy of words. We're all familiar with writing like this. Oh, words are so limited, they just can't possibly represent the complexity of the question at hand. That's extremely tedious, and no one wants to read that. If words aren't sufficient to capture the complexity of the topic that you have in view, then why are you writing about it? So a working assumption of classic style is that language is in fact sufficient, otherwise you wouldn't be writing. Everything that can be known can be said. Moreover, it's always possible to achieve a perfect fit between a thought and its expression. Language isn't limited. Writers are limited. Finally, Classic style assumes that thought and language match. They are made for each other because they emerge from the same experience. Relevant to this, classic style takes for granted a scene that cognitive scientists call joint attention. Joint attention is a familiar and common scene, one we experience routinely. In joint attention, people in one place are attending to one thing. So take a look at the photograph. Everyone in this picture is looking at the same thing. They know they are all attending to it, and they know that by attending to it, they are engaged with one another. They are jointly interacting. What is essential is common and interactive attention. Joint attention is a fundamental way that human beings learn, and it starts as early as 9 months of age. So take a look at this mother and daughter in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. The daughter is pointing something, and she's directing her mother's attention. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about joint attention. It occurs when 2 or more people focus on the same object, they monitor each other's attention, and they coordinate each other's attention. And this is basically what you're doing when you write in the classic style. Classic joint attention is the simplest and most basic kind of joint attention. There are just 2 people paying attention to something that is directly perceptible. Remember, classic style thinks of thought in terms of perception. So when you think something clearly, you see it for yourself. Then you provide transparent presentation of the thing that you've seen so that someone else can see it. So when you sit down to write, it's just you and your reader. And the entire goal is to achieve a state of joint attention. To summarize the points we've covered, first, the truth can be known by anyone willing to search for it. Prose is a window. It should never call attention to itself. It should be transparent. The writer is authentic. She stands fully behind what she says. The writer is sufficient because she's authorized by the truth. The writer is competent. She doesn't engage in self-doubt. The writer works invisibly. She never shows you her process. She only gives you the final product. The reader is competent. We don't beg for her interest. We assume that she's an equal in a conversation. Thought precedes speech. Never show your thought process. Writing is something that happens after the thinking is done. Language is sufficient. Only writers are limited. Thought and language match because they emerge from the same experience. And finally, joint attention anchors all of these assumptions. The idea that you should always keep in mind is that you are engaged with your reader in an endeavor to get him or her to see what it is that you have already seen. Thanks for your attention and happy writing.